A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to films I'm willing to talk about again. So, for this instance, why don't we go on ahead and talk about a certain trilogy that existed between 1973 and 2006. But, unlike with most other series of films that I've talked about in the past, this one's not exactly like the usual format of a trilogy. No, instead this is a movie with a sequel that came out 30 years later, and then a live-action remake. I'm specifically talking about the famous E.B. White novel film adaptation, Charlotte's Web. Yeah, some people have in fact been requesting me to come back to this, and even talk a bit more about the sequel. But as a bonus, let's also talk a bit about the live-action remake, which I won't have all that much to say. But we'll give it its own shot here in the series, for the sake of things. Anyways though, Charlotte's Web is a highly acclaimed piece which was made possible by Paramount in the year 1973. Although the copyright date in the opening title sequence says 1972. So I guess you could say it took a little while for this film to get around to. But all in all, for 1973, there were actually plenty of other films that had come around by this point. I mean, you had Disney's Robin Hood, you had American Graffiti, and who could forget the amalgamation of different things that went down. Exorcist, Sting, Paper Moon, Enter the Dragon. I mean, it was a pretty busy year by all means. There was even the original Wicker Man that came out in 1973. Like I said, busy year by movie standards. But, of all things, I will say that Charlotte's Web was probably one of the more memorable bits that I've had over the course of my life when it came to that particular year in history. By film standards, it sure does well. And it certainly does hold on in a pretty epic way, not only telling us the somewhat horrifying story of a young pig whom apparently was going to be put up on the chopping block. Quite literally, in fact. In any case, though, this tells us about the certain story about one particular spring in which the Arable family, which is comprised of the likes of John, Fern, as well as Avery and their mother, they're all out on the Arable farm, which of course has a pig and a fresh new litter of piglets. So, one of the piglets, however, was different than the others. He was considered a runt, thereby deviant, according to the Arable family. And John himself is more than determined to put him up there on the executioner's table, if you will. However, Fern is apprehensive about it, so much so that she just rushes outside to try and stop her father, which it's quite a bitter, emotional moment where a poor pig's life is on the line, and that Fern was one of those individuals whom has had all the care in the world to help preserve life, no matter how ugly it seems. I mean, this is something today everybody wants to try and preserve. Everybody. Doesn't matter how special they are. However, this pig, whom is eventually named Wilbur by Fern herself, was indeed taken care of and does actually grow up to be a decent pig. While when he started off as a runt, he was certainly looked upon with a unique relationship in mind. But let's keep in mind, Charlotte's Web was in fact a musical film. Yeah. So of course, we gotta expect songs all over the place. One song in particular did house the relationship that Fern and Wilbur had, the fun they shared together as Wilbur grew older and larger in size, eventually leading up into the very point in where he gets too old and too big to be on the Arable farm for long. His brothers and sisters have been sold off, and John confesses to Fern that Wilbur's going to have to go as well. She gets emotional once again, Avery waltzes inside, and all the crap they went through, including a certain stormy night where Avery himself believed a ghost was in his bed when it was actually Wilbur, whom was scared to death from the lightning and thunder. But after all is said and done, they do agree that Wilbur will be sold off to Fern's uncle Homer Zuckerberg, and his farm, which is a bit of ways down the road. Also, we can't forget to mention about a certain person known by the name of Henry Fussy, whom has a bit of a strict mother, and is basically entitled to have a certain skill set, playing the violin to be specific, and not having anything luxurious like pets in the house. Not even Wilbur was welcomed by his mother. But you know what? When Wilbur does have his new home set up for him by Mr. Zuckerberg himself, as well as his assistant, Wilbur unfortunately does struggle to make it through. And even though they did confirm that he wasn't going to be killed by John, by Homer it was different. Zuckerberg technically still held the belief that soon Wilbur was going to have to be put up there for pounds of bacon and pork. Yeah. Wilbur obviously is not happy about this. He gets so scared that he starts to cry really badly. A voice comes out asking him to be quiet and get some sleep. Apart from all the farm animals having a slightly hint of bad blood, especially after knowing the fact that Wilbur could actually talk and get so excited about it, he puts up his own song about that whole thing. I know. You're probably thinking that I hate this film, but I'll have plenty more to say about it as we go further here. Well, the thing is that while the farm animals of Zuckerberg's farm aren't too happy about Wilbur's antics, being the youthful and energetic pig that he is, obviously it's the moment where they tell him that he's eventually going to be killed by Zuckerberg himself. That puts him in tears. And this voice calling out to him happens to be coming from above, near the door of the farm. And the door frame itself has a giant web. And from the web comes a spider. And the spider's name is Charlotte. And there's also a rat out there as well named Templeton. So, of course, we are more than introduced to the good majority of the cast in mind. Talking animals aside, this is the big point where Wilbur eventually does calm down and get some rest. His first night at Zuckerberg's farm wasn't all too great. However, with the following morning and onwards, he eventually will become accustomed to the new things in mind, including feeding intervals of slop that were in fact made possible by Zuckerberg's assistant, known as Lurvy. But, of course, the real beauty when it comes to Charlotte Webb's plot is the fact that Wilbur is more than determined to keep alive. And more so when you get to understand the fact that Charlotte herself actually comes up with a certain plan to keep Wilbur alive for as long as possible. And while certain antics happen to take place along with some usual shenanigans in mind, including some food hideaways by Templeton, and even the birth of some new goslings, the Mother Goose basically comes around, and one of the goslings does become instant friends with Wilbur. And the thing is, though, is that while this gosling is not wanting to go out swimming with the rest of his family, staying with Wilbur instead, it's basically that unique sense that, much like Wilbur, he is in fact born special, and therefore has a unique thing going for him, much like how Wilbur used to have something special to the point where John Arable did in fact want to put him down for being a runt. Yeah, this is the kind of thing that we never see today, no matter what it is. We do eventually come back and forth to certain points where Fern becomes more involved with the plot, especially knowing that she visits Zuckerberg's farm from time to time, because Homer is her uncle after all. And while the family is not necessarily content on the idea of her constantly visiting the farm, trying to encourage her to go out and about and do some life instead, like shopping, out with friends and whatnot, she happens to have more of the relationship with the farm animals instead. But however, the big moment does come. Lurvy comes across the web in the barn, and it happens to spell out a word. Well, this word happens to be known as terrific. Yep. Turns out Charlotte was busy working for a whole night long, creating a special message, a subliminal hint that Wilbur is indeed a terrific pig. Yep. So right then and there, Lurvy, Homer, as well as some company happen to arrive on the scene, seeing the web in front of them, and realizing it's a work of art. More than worth talking about on the newspaper, more than worth talking about in various different ways possible, spreading the word to as many people as possible. And it doesn't stop there. We eventually get to see another term printed on the web. Yeah, talk about Charlotte putting in a lot of extra effort. Just so we get to see more of Wilbur staying alive for as long as possible, to avoid being slaughtered by Zuckerberg. But of course, it only gets better from here on out. Because basically, with all the company that comes around, and all the people that come to see Wilbur and the barn in question, Homer is actually invited to the fairground. Yep, the state fairs come around in that particular year. They decide to bring Wilbur along as a special attraction, all because the news about the web in question happens to bring about a lot of people. Kind of like one of those viral posts that gets a lot of attention. While the fair takes place, the likes of Charlotte, Wilbur, and Templeton do make their way out there, with Charlotte once again casting a certain word, this time reading humble. And when you get to truly know about the intents of her keeping Wilbur alive for a long time, and Templeton eventually getting the idea to satisfy all of his amazing cravings and wants. I mean, like I've said, the musical proportions just carry on all around, but the real beauty is the fact that Charlotte was able to keep Wilbur around for this long with all these words she's made, that even after an epic parade was made, with the Barbershop Quartet in mind, and Homer receiving a $25 reward, and high recognition for his star pig himself, Wilbur. Homer becomes infatuated with all this attention to the point where he announces to the people he intends to keep Wilbur around for as long as possible. This not only satisfies Wilbur, but everybody else. So, now you know. This is what truly seals Wilbur's fate. He is to be kept alive until he dies of old age. And this, of course, more than keeps him in check. Wilbur does make it back after the parade kicks off, comes to an end. And when they're basically supposed to leave the following morning, well, I guess you could say that what happens is that Charlotte eventually talks to Wilbur about her life coming to an end. It all in all brings about an emotional moment in life where us audience members get to witness the circle of life in her end come to a conclusion. Her remaining strength is summoned, and she passes on. Wilbur cannot believe what he has seen and heard. His new best friend, that he has known for a while, is dead. And by the time it is time for them to go back to the farm, the likes of Templeton and Wilbur, that is, the fairgrounds are obviously a mess. But of course, between Fern, Henry, Fussy, Avery, everybody else, they realize that Wilbur is indeed quite sad. Obviously not from the fact that he's going to be kept around for a long time, thanks to Homer, but it's because of Charlotte's death. However, this indeed is the point where Wilbur is indeed brought back to the farm, gets to rest on his manure pile once again instead of some uncomfortable straw pile that he had while inside that crate. And well, fall comes around, then winter, then back to spring once again. And all this time had come around, Wilbur had noticed a large pod full of eggs that Charlotte left behind before they left for the fairgrounds. And Wilbur did indeed intend to keep them safe for as long as possible, until the spring comes around, which they finally hatch. Wilbur becomes surprised and wonders, where are all those spider youth going? But then came 3 surprises before him. Turns out there were 3 spiders that were not exactly born alike, much like all the others that came around. Charlotte made dozens of children just like that, and however, only 3 got to stick around for the next generation of life itself. These 3 spiders were in fact given new names: Nellie, Joy, and Urania. These 3 intended to carry on the legacy of Charlotte, but more importantly, to ensure that not only does Wilbur have something to remember by, but also to have new friends close by to aid him in his journey of preventing himself from being slaughtered. So all in all, a movie like this has had a lot of foundation to it, and the build-ups all the way to the very top of the structure that is this movie's plot, story, characters, levels, animation, which was mostly made possible by Japanese-American animator Iwao Takuda, whom was also well known for various other works, including Scooby-Doo. Takamoto had done a lot of things animated like, not just with Disney and Hanna-Barbera, and plenty of other things. But of course, apart from animation, cast, story, based on a well-known novel by E.B. White, it's more than clear to us this was definitely more of an event than just a film. For 1973, they did an astounding job with this one, combining musical elements with a unique satire and somewhat dramatic bits about a pig who was born different than the others. Originally intended for meat, but was saved by a young girl and eventually sent off over to a farm in which he would meet up with his spider friend, and having his own legacy made possible thanks to her intuitions as a spider web maker. Yeah. All of this would have never been made possible had it not been for Charlotte. I mean, even the likes of Zuckerman and Lurvy, they weren't entirely intending on keeping Wilbur around for long. At least until Charlotte came around and changed their lives. Probably forever, even. However, this actually wouldn't be all that the Charlotte's Web series would have to give us. Because apart from what the book turned into a movie, there eventually would come along a sequel, 30 years later. Tomorrow I'll talk more on that in better detail, so that way you guys can get a first-hand look and listen in a much better, refined version of my own review of Charlotte's Web 2, Wilbur's Great Adventure. So, until that happens, Charlotte's Web, part 1 at least here, gets a solid 9.0 out of 10.1. A big classic with a lot of big things around it, including storyline and animation. And if you want to see more, go down to my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.
Whenever I want, I usually get, and I'm thinking I want you, but I don't have you yet. I ain't got no tricks to be playing on you.